The summer of 1914 began like any other in the grand capitals of Europe. In Vienna, couples waltzed in elegant ballrooms beneath crystal chandeliers. In Berlin, military officers strolled down tree-lined boulevards, their polished boots clicking against cobblestone streets. In Paris, artists gathered in smoky cafes, debating philosophy and painting. In London, gentlemen in top hats hurried through the fog-shrouded city, clutching morning newspapers filled with reports of distant colonial adventures. Yet beneath this veneer of civilization, something darker was stirring. Ancient hatreds simmered between nations. Military buildups accelerated. Secret alliances bound countries together in webs of obligation that would soon strangle the continent. The great powers of Europe were sleepwalking toward catastrophe, and few could imagine the horror that was about to unfold. Picture this: a world where warfare still carried romantic notions of honor and glory, where cavalry charges seemed perfectly reasonable military tactics, where generals believed battles would be decided by courage and steel rather than machine guns and poison gas. This was a world that still believed in quick, decisive conflicts settled by Christmas. They had no idea they were about to witness the birth of modern warfare in all its mechanized brutality. The story I'm about to tell you spans 4 years, from 1914 to 1918. It's the story of how a single gunshot in a Balkan city would cascade into the deadliest conflict humanity had ever known. How millions of young men would march off to war with flowers in their rifle barrels, only to find themselves trapped in muddy trenches, facing horrors beyond imagination. How empires that had stood for centuries would crumble into dust. How the very fabric of civilization would be torn apart and rebuilt. This isn't just a tale of battles and generals, though we'll encounter plenty of both. It's the story of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. The French farmer who watched German soldiers march through his wheat fields. The British mother who sent 4 sons to war and welcomed none home. The German U-boat captain who struggled with orders to sink passenger ships. The American doughboy who crossed an ocean to fight in someone else's war. By the time this story ends, over 17 million people will be dead. 4 empires will have collapsed. The map of Europe will be redrawn, and the seeds will be planted for an even more devastating conflict, just 20 years later. But all of that begins with understanding how the world of 1914 created the conditions for such unprecedented destruction. Let me take you back to that vanished world, where horse-drawn carriages shared streets with the first automobiles, where telegraph wires carried news at lightning speed across continents, where photography was capturing reality in ways humanity had never seen before. It was a world of incredible technological progress and stubborn political traditions. A world where steam-powered battleships bristled with guns, yet diplomats still settled disputes through handwritten letters delivered by courier. The Europe of 1914 was dominated by 5 great powers, each nursing grievances and ambitions that would soon collide with catastrophic force. In the heart of the continent stood Germany, a newly unified nation flexing its industrial muscles and demanding what it called its place in the sun. To the east sprawled the vast Russian Empire, ruled by a czar who still believed in divine right, even as revolution bubbled beneath the surface. In the west, France nursed wounds from its humiliating defeat by Germany 4 decades earlier, dreaming of revenge and the return of its lost provinces. Across the English Channel, Britain ruled the waves with the world's most powerful navy, but watched nervously as Germany's fleet grew stronger each year. And in the south, the Austro-Hungarian Empire struggled to hold together a patchwork of ethnic groups who increasingly wanted independence. These weren't just political entities on a map. They were living, breathing societies with their own cultures, dreams, and fears. German students sang patriotic songs in beer halls while their professors preached theories of racial superiority. Russian peasants toiled in fields they didn't own while their landlords danced at glittering balls in St. Petersburg. French schoolchildren learned to hate Germany from textbooks that depicted their neighbors as barbarous invaders. British sailors patrolled distant seas, carrying the white man's burden to far-flung colonies. Austrian bureaucrats shuffled papers in Vienna while Slavic nationalists plotted revolution in the empire's restless provinces. The spark that would ignite this powder keg came from an unlikely place: the Balkans, that turbulent crossroads where Europe meets Asia. Here, the declining Ottoman Empire had left a vacuum of power that the great powers rushed to fill. Here, ancient ethnic hatreds mixed with modern nationalist ideologies to create a toxic brew of resentment and ambition. And here, in the dusty streets of Sarajevo, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip would fire the shots heard round the world. But before we reach that fateful moment on June 28, 1914, we need to understand the deeper currents that were already pulling Europe toward war. The arms race that saw nations spending unprecedented sums on weapons they prayed they'd never use. The alliance system that was supposed to preserve peace, but instead guaranteed that any local conflict would become a continental catastrophe. The imperial rivalries that turned distant colonies into potential flashpoints. The rise of mass media that could whip entire populations into patriotic frenzy within days. Most importantly, we need to understand the mindset of the men who would make the crucial decisions in the summer of 1914. These weren't madmen or warmongers, at least not most of them. They were products of their time, shaped by assumptions about honor, duty, and national greatness that seem alien to us today. They lived in a world where backing down from a challenge was seen as worse than war itself, where military timetables, once set in motion, became almost impossible to stop, where the complexity of modern alliances meant that mobilizing for a limited conflict could trigger unlimited war. The technology existed to make this war more destructive than any in human history. Factories could mass-produce rifles, artillery shells, and poison gas on an industrial scale. Railroads could move entire armies across continents in days. Telegraph cables could coordinate military operations across vast distances. Yet the military doctrines remained rooted in an earlier age, when battles were decided by elan and bayonet charges rather than machine guns and barbed wire. As we follow this story from its beginning in the Balkans to its end in a railway car in a French forest, we'll witness the death of the old world and the traumatic birth of the new. We'll see how warfare evolved from romantic adventure to mechanized slaughter, how propaganda replaced truth in the battle for public opinion, how entire societies mobilized for total war in ways previously unimaginable, how the home front became almost as important as the battlefield itself. This is a story of unimaginable courage and heartbreaking tragedy, of tactical brilliance and strategic blindness, of technological innovation and human stubbornness, of empires that seemed eternal crumbling in a matter of months, of ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of heroism and sacrifice. The Great War, as it came to be known, was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Instead, it became the first chapter in humanity's bloodiest century. The lessons learned in its trenches would be applied to even deadlier effect 2 decades later. The political settlements that ended it would create new grievances that would fester for generations. But all of that lies ahead. For now, let us return to that summer of 1914, when the old world was about to die and few could imagine what would take its place, when diplomats still believed in the balance of power and generals still planned for short, decisive campaigns. When young men across Europe were about to learn that modern war was nothing like the glorious adventures they'd read about in books. The stage is set. The actors are in place. The mechanisms of destruction are primed and ready. All that remains is for a single gunshot to set in motion the greatest catastrophe the world had ever seen. And so our story begins, not with armies marching or cannons firing, but with a wrong turn on a sunny morning in Sarajevo, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand's driver took a fatal detour that would change the course of human history forever. The morning of June 28, 1914, dawned bright and clear in Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary had come to observe military maneuvers in this restless corner of his uncle's empire. At 49, the heir to the dual monarchy was a man of contradictions, a passionate hunter who collected exotic trophies, yet also a reformer who dreamed of giving the empire's Slavic peoples greater autonomy. A devoted husband to his morganatic wife Sophie, whom court protocol constantly humiliated because of her lower noble birth. The Archduke had ignored warnings about visiting Sarajevo on this particular date. June 28th was Vidovdan, the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, a day sacred to Serbian nationalism. It was the anniversary of their medieval defeat by the Ottomans, transformed by centuries of folk memory into a symbol of martyrdom and eventual resurrection. To many Serbs, the presence of an Austrian archduke in their holy city on this day was a deliberate provocation. Franz Ferdinand's motorcade wound through the narrow streets of Sarajevo that morning, past crowds of onlookers who had gathered to catch a glimpse of the royal visitors. The security arrangements were remarkably casual by modern standards. No bulletproof glass, no extensive background checks on spectators, no advanced teams securing every rooftop and alleyway. The Archduke and his wife sat in an open car, vulnerable to anyone with enough determination and a steady hand. Among the crowd were 7 young conspirators, members of a secret society called the Black Hand. They were barely more than teenagers, these would-be assassins, filled with romantic notions of dying for the Serbian cause. They carried bombs and pistols provided by Serbian military intelligence, though they had received little training in how to use them effectively. Their plan was simple and desperate: throw their bombs at the Archduke's car as it passed, then swallow cyanide and shoot themselves to avoid capture. The first attempt came at 10:10 in the morning. Nedeljko Čabrinović hurled his bomb at the Archduke's car, but the driver spotted the black object arcing through the air and accelerated. The bomb bounced off the folded hood of the convertible and exploded under the following car, wounding several officers and bystanders. Čabrinović swallowed his cyanide, but the poison was old and weak. He vomited instead of dying, then tried to drown himself in the shallow Miljaka River before being dragged away by police and an angry crowd. The other conspirators, seeing their plan had failed, seemed to lose their nerve. As the motorcade sped away toward the town hall, they melted back into the crowd. At the town hall, Franz Ferdinand was furious. He berated the mayor during the official reception, declaring that he had come to Sarajevo in friendship, only to be greeted with bombs. His anger was understandable, but it would prove fatal. The original plan had been for the royal couple to return by the same route after the reception. Now, concerned for their safety, officials decided to change the route and speed directly to the hospital to visit the officers wounded in the morning's attack. Here, in this moment of improvisation, fate took a hand. The new route was not properly communicated to all the drivers. When the motorcade left the town hall, the first car turned onto Franz Joseph Street, as originally planned. The Archduke's driver, seeing the lead car turn, began to follow before his passenger shouted at him to stop. This was the wrong way. They needed to continue straight to reach the hospital. The driver stopped the car and began to reverse. But the manual transmission of the 1911 Graf and Stift touring car was difficult to manage. The engine stalled. The car sat motionless in the middle of the street, just 5 feet away from a delicatessen where one of the failed conspirators had stopped to buy a sandwich. Gavrilo Princip couldn't believe his luck. The target he had given up hope of reaching was now sitting stationary right in front of him. The 19-year-old stepped forward, drew his Belgian-made FN Model 1910 pistol, and fired 2 shots at point-blank range. The first bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. The second hit Sophie in the abdomen. Both shots would prove fatal. Franz Ferdinand remained conscious for several minutes as his car raced toward the governor's residence. His last words, spoken to his dying wife, were, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." She died first, slumping against his shoulder. He followed minutes later, his blood soaking through his military uniform decorated with medals from a dozen imperial ceremonies. Princip tried to shoot himself, but was wrestled to the ground by bystanders before he could pull the trigger. Like his fellow conspirator, he attempted to swallow cyanide, but the poison failed to work. He would survive to stand trial, though at 19, he was too young under Austrian law to face execution. He would die in prison 4 years later, his body wasted by tuberculosis, just months before his dream of South Slavic liberation became reality. The immediate aftermath of the assassination seemed almost anticlimactic. There was no immediate declaration of war, no mobilization of armies, no sense that the world had just witnessed a pivotal moment in history. The foreign ministries of Europe issued routine condemnations of the terrorist attack. Stock markets remained steady. Most newspapers treated it as a regional incident with limited broader implications. But in the halls of power in Vienna and Berlin, different calculations were being made. The assassination provided Austria-Hungary with the pretext it had been seeking to deal with the Serbian problem once and for all. For years, the dual monarchy had watched nervously as Serbian nationalism inspired unrest among its own South Slavic populations. Serbia's victories in the recent Balkan Wars had only made the problem worse, creating a beacon of pan-Slavic aspiration that threatened the very foundations of the multinational empire. Emperor Franz Joseph, devastated by the loss of his nephew and heir, was initially reluctant to pursue military action. At 84, he had seen enough war to know its costs, but he was surrounded by advisors who argued that the monarchy's survival depended on crushing Serbian nationalism before it infected the empire's own Slavic populations. Chief of Staff Konrad von Hötzendorf had been advocating a preventive war against Serbia for years. Now he had his justification. The key question was whether Germany would support Austrian action against Serbia. Without German backing, Austria-Hungary could not risk war, knowing that Russia would likely intervene to protect its Slavic protégé. On July 5th, Austrian representatives met with Kaiser Wilhelm II at his palace in Potsdam. The Kaiser, impulsive and bellicose as always, assured his allies of Germany's complete support. This blank check would prove to be one of the most fateful diplomatic decisions in history. What followed was a month of diplomatic maneuvering that historians would later call the July Crisis. Austria-Hungary deliberately delayed its response to the assassination, using the time to prepare for war while allowing international outrage over the terrorist attack to solidify. Meanwhile, German leaders convinced themselves that the conflict could be localized, that Russia would not risk general war over a Balkan incident, and that if it did, Germany's superior military organization would ensure quick victory. They were catastrophically wrong on all counts. The alliance system that had been constructed to preserve peace instead guaranteed that any significant conflict would escalate beyond control. Russia was bound by treaty and national honor to support Serbia. France was obligated to support Russia. Britain, while not formally committed, could not allow Germany to dominate the continent. The German military's Schlieffen Plan, designed to win a two-front war through speed and audacity, required attacking France through Belgium, which would inevitably bring Britain into the conflict. On July 23rd, Austria-Hungary delivered an ultimatum to Serbia that was deliberately designed to be unacceptable. It demanded not just punishment of those responsible for the assassination, but effective Austrian control over Serbian judicial and police affairs. Serbia's response, delivered 2 days later, accepted most of the demands, but rejected those that would have compromised its sovereignty. To neutral observers, Serbia's reply seemed remarkably conciliatory. But Austria-Hungary had already decided on war. The dominoes began to fall with sickening inevitability. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia began mobilizing to support its ally. Germany demanded that Russia halt its mobilization, and receiving no satisfactory response, declared war on Russia on August 1st. France, bound by its alliance with Russia, began mobilizing its own forces. Germany, following the logic of the Schlieffen Plan, declared war on France on August 3rd and invaded Belgium to reach French territory quickly. The invasion of Belgium finally brought Britain into the conflict. The British government had wavered for days, torn between its traditional policy of avoiding continental entanglements and its recognition that German domination of Europe would threaten British interests. But Germany's violation of Belgian neutrality, which Britain had guaranteed by treaty, provided the moral justification the government needed. On August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. Within a week of Austria's declaration of war on Serbia, most of Europe was at war. The complex alliance system had worked exactly as its critics had feared, transforming a regional crisis into a continental catastrophe. What had begun as an attempt to solve the South Slavic problem had become a struggle for the future of European civilization. The men who made these decisions did not fully understand what they were unleashing. They thought in terms of the last great European war, the Franco-Prussian conflict of 1870-71, which had been decided in a matter of months. They could not imagine trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, or battles consuming millions of shells in single days, or casualty lists that would dwarf the populations of entire cities. The war they thought they were fighting would be decided by courage, discipline, and superior organization. The war they actually began would be won by industrial capacity, technological innovation, and the ability to endure suffering on an unprecedented scale. It would be a war not just between armies, but between entire societies mobilized for total conflict. As August 1914 dawned, millions of men across Europe were putting on uniforms and kissing their families goodbye. They marched off to war with flowers in their rifles and songs on their lips, convinced they would be home for Christmas. The lucky ones would return as broken men, forever changed by what they had witnessed in the hell of modern warfare. Many would never return at all. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand had lit a fuse that would burn for 4 terrible years, consuming empires and ideologies, cities and countrysides, dreams and innocence. The old world was about to die in ways its inhabitants could not imagine. And from its ashes would rise a new order shaped by the unprecedented trauma of industrialized warfare. The Great War was about to begin. The armies that marched to war in August 1914 were unlike anything the world had ever seen. Millions of men moved across Europe with mechanical precision, loaded into cattle cars and transported to frontiers their grandfathers had never imagined crossing in anger. The mobilization itself was a marvel of industrial organization, railway timetables that had been perfected over decades, supply depots positioned with mathematical accuracy, reservists appearing at designated points as if summoned by some invisible hand. In Germany, the Schlieffen Plan unfolded like clockwork. 7 field armies wheeled through Belgium and northern France in a massive arc designed to envelop Paris and crush French resistance in 6 weeks. The plan's architect, Count Alfred von Schlieffen, had died the previous year, but his ghost haunted every German staff officer as they attempted to execute his grand design. "Keep the right wing strong," had been his dying words, and the German High Command threw everything they had into that sweeping right hook through Belgium. The German soldiers who crossed into Belgium on August 4th were among the best-trained troops in the world. They had been drilled to perfection in the Prussian military tradition, where discipline was everything and initiative was discouraged. Their gray uniforms were practical rather than colorful. Their equipment was standardized and efficient. Their officers were products of rigorous military academies. They carried the latest Mauser rifles and were supported by some of the finest artillery in Europe. Most importantly, they believed absolutely in their cause and their inevitable victory. But the Belgians, despite their small army and outdated fortifications, refused to simply step aside. The fortress city of Liège, supposedly obsolete in the age of modern artillery, held out for 12 days against German siege guns. Belgian civilians, outraged by the invasion of their neutral country, began sniping at German columns and sabotaging railway lines. The German response was swift and brutal. Entire villages were burned. Civilians were shot as franc-tireurs, and the ancient library of Louvain was destroyed in reprisal for alleged civilian resistance. These early atrocities, real and imagined, set the tone for a conflict that would quickly abandon the civilized conventions of 19th-century warfare. German soldiers, raised on stories of French civilian resistance during the Franco-Prussian War, saw snipers behind every window and spies in every shadow. Belgian and French civilians, witnessing the destruction of their homes and communities, began to see the Germans not as fellow Europeans, but as barbarian invaders who had abandoned all claims to civilization. Meanwhile, the French were implementing their own strategic vision with equally tragic results. Plan 17, the French answer to German preparation, called for an immediate offensive into Alsace-Lorraine, the provinces lost to Germany in 1871. French military doctrine, influenced by the philosophy of the offensive spirit, held that moral superiority and élan vital could overcome mere material advantages. French soldiers charged into battle wearing bright blue coats and red trousers, their officers leading from the front with white gloves and ceremonial swords. The results were catastrophic. German machine guns and artillery carved through French infantry formations with industrial efficiency. The Battle of the Frontiers, fought in the last weeks of August, cost France over 200,000 casualties in 5 days. Entire regiments ceased to exist, their colors lost in muddy fields along the German border. The French army, which had marched to war confident in its superiority, found itself in full retreat within weeks of mobilization. In the east, the Russian steamroller was beginning its ponderous advance into East Prussia. The Russian army was massive, over 4 million men under arms, but it was also backward, corrupt, and inadequately supplied. Russian soldiers often lacked boots, ammunition, and sometimes even rifles. Their officers were frequently incompetent aristocrats more concerned with court politics than military efficiency. Yet there were so many of them, and their willingness to accept casualties was so absolute that German planners had nightmares about endless waves of Slavic infantry overwhelming their carefully prepared positions. The first major battle in the east took place at Tannenberg, where two Russian armies blundered into a trap set by German generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff. The Battle of Tannenberg became a masterpiece of military encirclement, with an entire Russian army of 150,000 men destroyed in just 4 days. The Russian commander, General Samsonov, wandered into the forest and shot himself rather than face the disgrace of such a complete defeat. It was a stunning victory that made Hindenburg a national hero and seemed to confirm German military superiority. But even as they celebrated their tactical brilliance, German leaders were beginning to realize that the Schlieffen Plan was failing in the West. The Belgian delay had cost precious time. French resistance was proving more stubborn than expected. The British Expeditionary Force, though small, was fighting with professional skill that German planners had not anticipated. Most critically, the Russians had mobilized faster than anyone thought possible, forcing Germany to divert troops to the Eastern Front just when they were needed most in France. The German advance through Belgium and northern France became a race against time. Each day of delay made the plan less likely to succeed, but the German armies pressed on with mechanical determination. They swept through Brussels, scattered the small British force at Mons, and pushed deep into French territory. By early September, German advance guards were within sight of the Eiffel Tower. Parisians could hear the rumble of artillery from the suburbs. It was at this moment of supreme crisis that the French found their salvation in an unlikely source: Parisian taxicabs. General Joffre, the imperturbable French commander, had been quietly preparing a counterattack while his armies retreated. When he finally saw his opportunity, he commandeered every available vehicle in Paris to rush reinforcements to the front. 600 taxicabs carried French soldiers to the Battle of the Marne, creating one of the war's most enduring symbols of improvisation and democratic resistance. The Battle of the Marne, fought from September 6 to 12, 1914, marked the end of the war of movement in the West. German forces, exhausted by weeks of continuous marching and fighting, found themselves attacked on multiple fronts by French armies that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The German retreat was orderly but decisive. The Schlieffen Plan had failed, and with it, Germany's hopes for a quick victory in the West. Both sides now faced a strategic nightmare they had never seriously contemplated: a two-front war of indefinite duration. The German army dug in along the high ground north of the Aisne River, creating the first temporary trenches of what would become a permanent front line. The French and British, following the logic of military necessity, dug their own trenches facing the German positions. Neither side initially thought these earthworks would be permanent. They were just temporary expedients until the next offensive could break the deadlock. As autumn turned to winter in 1914, the opposing armies engaged in what historians call the Race to the Sea, a series of flanking movements as each side tried to outmaneuver the other. The race ended at the English Channel, where both armies ran out of room to maneuver. A continuous line of trenches now stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea, a distance of nearly 500 miles. Behind these trenches, millions of men settled in for what they still believed would be a temporary stalemate. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas had only just begun. The quick, decisive conflict envisioned by the generals had become something unprecedented in human history, an industrial war of attrition that would consume entire generations. The romantic notions of warfare that had sustained European civilization for centuries were about to be buried forever in the mud of the Western Front. In the East, the war maintained more of its traditional character, with armies still maneuvering across vast distances and battles still being won through superior strategy rather than superior firepower. But even there, the scale of casualties was beginning to dwarf anything from previous conflicts. The Battle of Łódź in November 1914 cost the Russians over 90,000 casualties, while German and Austrian losses were nearly as severe. The Austro-Hungarian army, in particular, was discovering that its polyglot composition made it poorly suited for modern warfare. Czech soldiers surrendered to the Russians in large numbers, seeing the war as an opportunity to escape Austrian rule. Hungarian units fought with skill and determination, but resented being used to suppress Slavic nationalism. German-Austrian officers struggled to communicate with troops who spoke a dozen different languages and felt loyalty to a dozen different ethnic causes. By the end of 1914, the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which had joined the war in November, controlled vast territories but had failed to achieve their primary objectives. Germany had not defeated France. Austria-Hungary had not crushed Serbia, and both faced the prospect of a prolonged struggle against enemies with superior resources and manpower. The Entente powers, France, Russia, and Britain, had survived the initial onslaught, but at tremendous cost. France had lost some of its most productive industrial regions to German occupation. Russia had suffered catastrophic defeats that had decimated its professional officer corps. Britain was beginning to realize that its small professional army was inadequate for continental warfare on this scale. As 1914 drew to a close, all the major powers were beginning to mobilize their societies for total war in ways that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The conflict that had begun with cavalry charges and bayonet attacks was evolving into something entirely new, a struggle between industrial systems rather than armies, a test of civilian morale as much as military skill, a war that would reshape not just the map of Europe, but the very nature of modern civilization. The soldiers shivering in their muddy trenches that first winter could not imagine that they were settling in for 4 years of the most destructive warfare in human history. They still wrote letters home promising to be back for the next Christmas, still believed that one more offensive would break the deadlock, still thought of war in terms of honor and glory rather than attrition and endurance. They were about to learn otherwise, in lessons written in blood across the battlefields of a continent consuming itself. The winter of 1914-1915 brought a strange new reality to the battlefields of Europe. Where cavalry had once thundered across open fields, now stretched an unbroken line of muddy scars in the earth. The trenches that soldiers had dug as temporary shelter became permanent homes, elaborate underground cities, complete with sleeping quarters, command posts, and communication tunnels. What had begun as simple scrapes in the dirt evolved into complex fortifications, protected by barbed wire, machine gun nests, and carefully positioned artillery. Life in these trenches defied every romantic notion of warfare that European civilization had cherished for centuries. Instead of glorious charges and heroic duels, soldiers found themselves living like moles, emerging only under cover of darkness to repair wire or gather intelligence. The space between the opposing trenches, soon christened No Man's Land, became a hellscape of shell craters, rotting corpses, and rusted metal. Nothing could live there for long. Not men, not animals, barely even the hardiest weeds. The daily routine of trench warfare settled into a grim rhythm that would define the next 4 years. Dawn brought the stand to, when every soldier manned the firing step in case the enemy chose that moment to attack. Breakfast consisted of whatever rations could be brought up during the night. tinned beef, hard biscuits, and tea that tasted of chlorine from the water purification tablets. The day passed in a mixture of boredom and terror, with sudden bursts of sniper fire or artillery bombardment breaking the monotony. Rats thrived in this environment, growing fat on the corpses that littered the battlefield. They became so numerous and bold that soldiers developed elaborate methods for hunting them, turning pest control into a form of entertainment. Lice were an even more persistent enemy, impossible to eliminate completely despite constant efforts. The phrase lousy entered common usage as soldiers described their infested clothing and miserable conditions. Disease spread rapidly in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of the trenches. Trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, could literally rot away a soldier's feet if left untreated. Dysentery ran rampant through units, weakened by poor food and contaminated water. Shell shock, a condition that military medicine was only beginning to understand, left thousands of men trembling, mute, or completely unable to function. Yet amid all this misery, human nature found ways to adapt and even flourish. Soldiers developed an elaborate culture of their own, with its own slang, songs, and humor. The British referred to German shells as whiz-bangs and called the enemy trenches across no man's land Fritz's place. French soldiers invented colorful expressions for the various types of wounds that might earn them a trip home. German troops composed melancholy songs about their longing for the homeland they might never see again. The technology of warfare was evolving at breakneck speed, driven by the desperate need to break the stalemate. Artillery became the dominant weapon of the Western Front, with guns growing larger and more accurate with each passing month. The French developed the legendary 75, a quick-firing field gun that could deliver devastating rapid fire. The Germans responded with massive siege mortars that could reduce any fortification to rubble. By 1915, artillery barrages lasting days or even weeks became common, consuming shells at rates that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. Machine guns, which had been relatively rare in 1914, multiplied rapidly as their deadly effectiveness became apparent. The German Maxim gun, in particular, became a symbol of the war's mechanical brutality. A single well-positioned machine gun could stop an entire battalion, mowing down advancing infantry with methodical precision. The sound of machine gun fire, a rapid, chattering roar, became the soundtrack of the Western Front. Gas warfare made its horrific debut in 1915, introducing a new dimension of terror to the battlefield. The Germans first used chlorine gas at the Second Battle of Ypres in April, releasing a yellow-green cloud that drifted across no man's land toward the Allied trenches. Soldiers who had never encountered this new weapon had no protection against it, and entire units fled in panic as the gas burned their lungs and blinded their eyes. The Allies quickly retaliated with their own gas attacks, and soon both sides were engaged in a chemical arms race that would produce increasingly deadly compounds. The introduction of gas masks gave soldiers a grotesque, insect-like appearance that seemed to symbolize the dehumanizing nature of modern warfare. Men who had once fought face-to-face with sword and bayonet now killed enemies they could barely see, using weapons that killed indiscriminately and left no room for individual heroism. The gas attack became a regular feature of trench warfare, with soldiers living in constant fear of the alarm that would send them scrambling for their masks. Aviation, barely a decade old when the war began, evolved from a novelty into a vital military tool. The first military pilots were essentially aerial scouts, flying flimsy biplanes held together with wire and fabric to observe enemy positions. But as the importance of air reconnaissance became clear, both sides began arming their aircraft and developing tactics for aerial combat. The romantic image of the fighter ace was born in these early dogfights, where individual skill and courage could still make a difference in an increasingly mechanized war. Names like Baron Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, and Captain Albert Ball became household words as the public seized on these aerial knights as symbols of the heroism that seemed absent from the muddy stalemate below. Their brightly painted aircraft and chivalrous behavior toward captured enemies recalled an earlier age of warfare, even as they pioneered tactics that would shape military aviation for decades to come. The naval war presented its own unique challenges and innovations. Britain's Royal Navy, the world's most powerful fleet, established a blockade of German ports that slowly strangled the Central Powers' access to vital supplies. German submarines, or U-boats, responded with their own form of economic warfare, targeting merchant ships carrying supplies to Britain. This underwater war would eventually draw neutral nations into the conflict and reshape international law regarding naval warfare. The sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania in May 1915 provided a glimpse of how the war was expanding beyond traditional military targets. When a German U-boat torpedoed the ship off the Irish coast, killing over 1,100 passengers and crew, including 128 Americans, it marked a new level of ruthlessness in modern warfare. The German commander claimed the ship was carrying munitions, making it a legitimate military target. But the image of women and children drowning in the cold Atlantic waters horrified neutral observers worldwide. On the Eastern Front, the war maintained more of its traditional character, with armies still maneuvering across vast distances and battles still being decided by superior strategy rather than superior firepower. The Russian army, despite its numerical superiority, continued to suffer from chronic shortages of equipment and competent leadership. Russian soldiers often went into battle without rifles, following behind their comrades and waiting to pick up weapons from the fallen. The Brusilov offensive of 1916 would demonstrate both the potential and the limitations of Russian military power. General Alexei Brusilov developed innovative tactics that initially achieved stunning success, breaking through Austrian lines and capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. But the offensive ultimately stalled due to inadequate supplies and reinforcements, costing Russia over 1 million casualties it could ill afford. Austria-Hungary found itself increasingly dependent on German support as its multi-ethnic army began to disintegrate under the strains of modern warfare. Czech and Slovak units surrendered to the Russians in large numbers, while Hungarian forces grew increasingly reluctant to fight for what they saw as German war aims. The dual monarchy's survival depended entirely on German military assistance, making it effectively a German satellite state. The Ottoman Empire's entry into the war opened new fronts across the Middle East and threatened Britain's lifeline to India through the Suez Canal. The disastrous Gallipoli campaign, intended to knock Turkey out of the war and open a supply route to Russia, instead became another bloody stalemate. Allied forces, including large numbers of Australian and New Zealand troops, clung to narrow beachheads while Turkish defenders, inspired by leaders like Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, fought with desperate courage to defend their homeland. The Arab Revolt, encouraged by British agents like T.E. Lawrence, opened another theater of operations as Arab nationalists struck at Ottoman supply lines and garrison towns. This desert war, fought with camels and rifles rather than trenches and artillery, seemed almost medieval compared to the industrial slaughter in Europe. Yet it would ultimately prove just as decisive in reshaping the post-war world. As 1915 progressed, the true scope of the conflict became clear to military and civilian leaders alike. This was not going to be a short war decided by a single decisive battle. Instead, it would be a prolonged test of national endurance, industrial capacity, and civilian morale. Entire societies would need to be mobilized for war production, with women entering factories to replace men who had gone to the front. Rationing would become a fact of life as governments diverted resources from civilian consumption to military needs. The concept of total war was being born in the factories and farms as much as on the battlefields. Victory would go not to the side with the most skillful generals or the bravest soldiers, but to the nation that could sustain the enormous material and human costs of prolonged industrial warfare. The romantic age of military glory was ending, replaced by an era of mechanized destruction that would reshape not just the political map of Europe, but the very nature of modern civilization. By the winter of 1915, over 2 million men were already dead, and the war had barely begun to reveal its full horror. The generals on both sides continued to plan offensives that would break the deadlock, unaware that they were trapped in a form of warfare that favored defense over attack, endurance over élan, and industrial production over individual heroism. The old world was dying in the mud of Flanders and the forests of the Eastern Front, but its death throes would continue for 3 more years of unprecedented destruction. The stage was set for battles that would dwarf anything in human history, campaigns that would consume entire armies in pursuit of objectives measured in yards rather than miles, and a transformation of warfare that would echo through the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The year 1916 dawned with a grim realization settling over the war-weary nations of Europe. The quick victory that every general had promised, the triumphant homecoming that every politician had predicted, the glorious adventure that every young man had imagined, all of these dreams lay buried beneath the frozen mud of the Western Front. What stretched ahead was not the romantic conclusion to a noble struggle, but an endless grinding of human flesh against industrial machinery, a test of which civilization could endure the most suffering while still calling itself civilized. The German High Command, faced with the failure of their master plan and the reality of a two-front war, made a fateful decision that would define the character of 1916. If they could not win through maneuver, they would win through attrition. If they could not break the French army in open battle, they would bleed it to death in a carefully chosen killing ground. The target they selected was Verdun, an ancient fortress city that held deep symbolic meaning for French national pride. General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of staff, conceived Operation Judgment as a coldly calculated act of strategic butchery. He would attack Verdun not necessarily to capture it, but to force the French to defend it at any cost. The French, he reasoned, would throw division after division into the meat grinder rather than lose this symbol of their resistance. Germany would use its superior artillery and defensive positions to methodically destroy the French army, unit by unit, until France bled to death. The battle began on February 21st, with the most intensive artillery bombardment in military history. Over 1,400 German guns, ranging from light field pieces to massive 400 mm siege mortars, poured shells onto the French positions for 10 continuous hours. The bombardment was so intense that it could be heard 160 kilometers away. Trees were reduced to splinters, villages vanished from the map, and the very landscape was resculpted by high explosives. French survivors described the experience as being inside a hurricane made of steel and fire. When the German infantry finally advanced, they found a moonscape of shell craters and pulverized concrete where French positions had once stood. The few surviving defenders, shell-shocked and half-buried, could offer little resistance. Fort Douaumont, the strongest fortress in the Verdun system, fell to a small German patrol in a matter of hours. It seemed that Falkenhayn's strategy was working perfectly. But the German general had made a crucial miscalculation. he had underestimated not just French determination, but French logistics. General Henri-Philippe Pétain, the defender of Verdun, organized a supply line that the French called la voie sacrée, the sacred way. Along this single road, a continuous stream of trucks carried ammunition, supplies, and fresh troops to the front, while evacuating the wounded and exhausted. It was an early demonstration of how motor transport could revolutionize military logistics, allowing armies to sustain combat at intensities previously impossible. The battle that Falkenhayn had designed as a controlled bloodletting became something far more terrible, a mutual destruction that consumed both armies with equal veracity. German attackers found themselves caught in the same killing fields they had created for their enemies. French artillery, guided by aerial observation and improved communications, delivered counter-battery fire with devastating accuracy. The carefully planned German offensive became a formless struggle where individual strongpoints changed hands dozens of times, each exchange measured in hundreds of casualties. For 10 months, the battle raged with an intensity that defied human comprehension. Soldiers on both sides described Verdun as hell on earth, a place where the normal rules of existence no longer applied. Men lived underground like animals, emerging only to fight and die in landscapes so devastated that they resembled alien planets. The constant artillery fire drove many soldiers insane, creating thousands of cases of shell shock that military medicine was powerless to treat. The French developed a rotation system that ensured most of their army passed through Verdun at some point during 1916. This democratization of suffering created a shared experience that would bind the French nation together for generations. Soldiers spoke of being fed to the mill at Verdun, ground up in a machine that consumed human lives with mechanical efficiency. Yet somehow, impossibly, they held on. While Verdun consumed German and French armies in equal measure, the British Empire was preparing its own bid to break the Western Front deadlock. General Douglas Haig, the commander of British forces in France, planned an offensive along the Somme River that would demonstrate the growing power of the British war machine. By the summer of 1916, Britain had transformed itself from a nation with a small professional army into a militarized society capable of fielding millions of soldiers. The volunteers who filled the ranks of Haig's army were unlike any soldiers Britain had previously sent to war. They were civilians in uniform, clerks and shopkeepers, miners and factory workers, university students and farm laborers who had answered their country's call with patriotic enthusiasm. Many had enlisted together in PALS battalions, local units that drew their recruits from specific towns, factories, or social organizations. This system created units with extraordinary esprit de corps. But it also meant that single battles could devastate entire communities when local battalions were destroyed. The British plan for the Somme offensive reflected both the promise and the limitations of their rapidly expanded army. A week-long artillery bombardment would destroy German defenses, after which the infantry would advance across no man's land to occupy the enemy trenches. It was a simple plan that required minimal tactical skill from the inexperienced troops, but it depended entirely on the artillery preparation being effective. The bombardment that began on June 24, 1916, was even more intense than the German barrage at Verdun. British guns fired over 1.7 million shells in 7 days, creating a continuous thunder that could be heard in London. The explosion of mines beneath German positions added to the devastation, with some detonations so massive they registered on seismographs as far away as Switzerland. British commanders were confident that nothing could survive such a pounding. They were catastrophically wrong. The German defenders, learning from their experiences at Verdun, had constructed deep bunkers that could withstand even the heaviest shells. Many of the British shells were defective, manufactured by inexperienced workers in hastily converted factories. Most critically, the British lacked the sophisticated fire control techniques that might have made their bombardment truly effective. When the guns lifted on the morning of July 1st, German machine gunners emerged from their shelters to find their weapons intact and their fields of fire cleared of obstacles by the British bombardment. What followed was the bloodiest single day in British military history. Wave after wave of infantry advanced across no man's land at walking pace, their officers having been told that the artillery had eliminated all resistance. German machine guns cut them down in rows, their bodies forming neat lines that marked the limits of each unsuccessful advance. By nightfall, the British had suffered 60,000 casualties, including 20,000 dead, in exchange for a few hundred yards of cratered ground. The Battle of the Somme continued for 4.5 months, becoming a grinding match of attrition that rivaled Verdun in its intensity and futility. New tactics slowly emerged from the carnage as both sides learned to adapt to the realities of trench warfare. The British developed creeping barrages that moved forward just ahead of attacking infantry, forcing defenders to keep their heads down until the assault troops were almost upon them. The Germans perfected defense in depth, creating multiple lines of trenches that could absorb and fragment attacking forces. Technology continued its rapid evolution under the pressure of military necessity. The British introduced tanks to the Somme battlefield in September 1916, though these early mechanical monsters were more valuable for their psychological impact than their tactical effectiveness. The sight of these steel behemoths crawling across no man's land, immune to rifle fire and capable of crushing barbed wire, terrified German defenders even when the tanks themselves broke down or became stuck in shell craters. The development of more sophisticated artillery techniques gradually gave attackers new advantages. Sound ranging and flash spotting allowed gunners to locate enemy batteries with unprecedented accuracy. Improved communications enabled rapid concentration of fire on specific targets. Most importantly, military leaders began to understand that artillery was not just a tool for destroying enemy positions, but for suppressing defenders during infantry assaults. Aircraft played an increasingly important role as the war matured beyond its primitive beginnings. No longer were pilots simply aerial observers armed with pistols and hand grenades. Specialized fighter aircraft engaged in deadly dogfights for control of the skies above the trenches. Bomber aircraft, still primitive but growing more sophisticated, began striking targets behind enemy lines. Most importantly, artillery spotting aircraft became the eyes of the guns, directing fire with an accuracy that would have been impossible from ground observation posts. The war at sea was undergoing its own transformation as both sides adapted to new realities. Germany's decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1917 represented a calculated gamble that would ultimately prove fatal to their cause. German naval leaders believed they could starve Britain into submission before American intervention could tip the balance, but they failed to account for the development of convoy systems and anti-submarine warfare techniques. The convoy system, initially resisted by British naval tradition that emphasized independent action, proved devastatingly effective against submarine attacks. Merchant ships sailing in groups protected by warships presented U-boat commanders with difficult targeting problems while concentrating defensive firepower. The development of depth charges, hydrophones, and other anti-submarine weapons gradually turned the hunter into the hunted beneath the waves. On the Eastern Front, the character of warfare remained more fluid, but no less deadly. The Brusilov offensive demonstrated that even the apparently backward Russian army could achieve tactical innovation when properly led. General Alexei Brusilov's techniques of simultaneous attacks along a broad front, Careful artillery preparation and thorough reconnaissance became models for later operations. The offensive's initial success shattered Austrian resistance and captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners, but ultimately stalled due to inadequate supplies and German reinforcements. The human cost of these massive battles was beginning to strain the social fabric of all the combatant nations. Casualty lists that would have horrified previous generations became routine features of daily newspapers. Entire classes of young men vanished from schools and universities, creating demographic gaps that would affect European society for decades. The concept of a lost generation was becoming literal reality as the flower of European youth was systematically destroyed in pursuit of military objectives measured in yards. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers as men departed for the front, fundamentally altering social relationships that had seemed permanent just years earlier. Female munitions workers, nicknamed "canary girls" because explosive chemicals turned their skin yellow, became symbols of civilian sacrifice for the war effort. Agricultural production increasingly depended on female labor as farm workers joined the army, challenging traditional gender roles in ways that would outlast the war itself. The home front was becoming almost as important as the battlefield in determining victory or defeat. Governments learned to mobilize not just armies, but entire societies, coordinating industrial production, managing civilian morale, and controlling information in ways that previous conflicts had never required. The concept of total war was evolving from military theory into social reality. Rationing became a fact of life as governments diverted resources from civilian consumption to military needs. Meatless days, wheatless days, and other conservation measures asked civilians to share in the sacrifice being made by soldiers at the front. Propaganda campaigns encouraged citizens to buy war bonds, grow victory gardens, and report suspicious activities that might indicate enemy espionage. The psychological impact of prolonged warfare was becoming apparent in ways that military leaders had never anticipated. Shell shock, initially dismissed as cowardice, was increasingly recognized as a genuine medical condition that could affect even the bravest soldiers. The constant stress of trench warfare, the random nature of artillery death, and the seeming futility of repeated offensives created mental casualties that sometimes outnumbered physical wounds. As 1916 drew to a close, the war had consumed over 4 million lives without producing a decisive result on any front. The Western Front remained essentially static, despite the enormous battles at Verdun and the Somme. The Eastern Front had seen dramatic movements, but no final resolution. The naval war had intensified, but had not yet reached its climax. All the major powers were beginning to show signs of strain, financial, industrial, and human, that suggested the conflict's ultimate outcome might be determined as much by civilian endurance as military prowess. The old professional armies that had marched to war in 1914 no longer existed. In their place stood mass armies of citizen soldiers, supported by entire societies mobilized for industrial warfare. The conflict had evolved beyond anything its architects had imagined, becoming a struggle not just between armies, but between competing ways of organizing modern civilization. The side that could best adapt its society, economy, and military to the demands of total war would ultimately emerge victorious. But that victory would come at a cost that would reshape the world forever. The year that had begun with hopes of decisive action was ending with the grim realization that the war had become a test of national survival. 1917 would bring even greater challenges as revolution, American intervention, and new military technologies combined to create the conditions for the war's eventual resolution. But that resolution lay hidden in a future that seemed impossibly distant to the exhausted soldiers shivering in their trenches as winter settled once again over the battlefields of Europe. The year 1917 opened with a world transformed beyond recognition from the confident, glittering societies that had celebrated the dawn of the 20th century. 3 years of industrial slaughter had shattered not just armies, but the very foundations of European civilization. Empires that had seemed eternal were cracking under strains no previous generation had imagined possible. The comfortable assumptions about progress, honor, and human nature that had sustained the old world were dissolving in the acid rain of modern warfare. In Russia, the signs of impending collapse were everywhere. Bread lines stretched through the frozen streets of Petrograd, while aristocrats still danced in overheated ballrooms, willfully blind to the revolution brewing in the slums beyond their palace walls. The Tsar's armies had lost millions of men in futile offensives, their bodies scattered across the vast battlefields of Eastern Europe like seeds that would never grow. Desertion was becoming epidemic as peasant soldiers abandoned their posts to return to villages where their families were starving. The Russian home front was disintegrating with alarming speed. Factory workers, many of them women who had replaced men sent to the front, labored under conditions that grew worse each month. Food shortages had become food crises, then food riots. The transportation system, never adequate for a country spanning 11 time zones, was breaking down completely under the demands of moving supplies to multiple fronts while maintaining civilian life in the rear. Tsar Nicholas II, that well-meaning but tragically inadequate ruler, seemed incapable of grasping the magnitude of the crisis engulfing his empire. He continued to play the role of an autocratic monarch in a world that had moved far beyond the divine right of kings. His German-born wife, Alexandra, had become deeply unpopular due to her association with the mystical monk Rasputin, whose influence over the royal family scandalized Russian society and undermined confidence in the monarchy itself. The murder of Rasputin in December 1916 by a group of nobles desperate to save the dynasty had only accelerated the monarchy's decline. Rather than restoring confidence in royal leadership, the killing had revealed the depths of elite desperation and the complete breakdown of normal political processes. By early 1917, even conservative politicians were openly discussing the need for the Tsar's abdication. When revolution finally erupted in March 1917, it came not through careful planning by revolutionary conspirators, but through the spontaneous collapse of a system that had simply stopped functioning. Bread riots in Petrograd escalated when soldiers refused orders to fire on civilian demonstrators. Within days, the centuries-old Romanov dynasty had crumbled, and Russia found itself under the uncertain leadership of a provisional government composed largely of liberal politicians who had never expected to inherit power under such chaotic circumstances. The February Revolution, as it came to be known, initially filled the Western allies with hope. Surely a democratic Russia would prosecute the war with greater efficiency and determination than the corrupt and incompetent Tsarist regime. The removal of autocracy would allow Russian society to mobilize its full potential against the Central Powers. American President Woodrow Wilson, who had struggled to justify supporting an alliance that included Tsarist autocracy, now proclaimed that the world was being made safe for democracy. These hopes proved tragically misplaced. The provisional government, led first by Prince Lvov and then by Alexander Kerensky, faced an impossible dilemma. They were committed to continuing the war effort to honor Russia's obligations to its allies. But the Russian people were exhausted by 3 years of devastating defeats and enormous casualties. The very forces that had brought down the Tsar, war weariness, economic collapse, and social revolution, made it impossible for any government to restore effective military operations. The situation was further complicated by the emergence of the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers and soldiers' deputies that claimed to represent the revolutionary masses. This created a system of dual power, with the provisional government holding legal authority, while the Soviet commanded the loyalty of many workers and soldiers. The Soviets' famous Order No. 1, which democratized military discipline and gave soldiers the right to elect their own committees, effectively destroyed what remained of Russian military effectiveness. Into this chaos stepped Vladimir Lenin, the exiled Bolshevik leader who returned to Russia in April 1917 with German assistance. Lenin's journey from Switzerland to Petrograd in a sealed railway car provided by the German government was one of history's most consequential trips. The Germans, recognizing that Lenin's revolutionary program would likely take Russia out of the war, were willing to risk supporting their ideological enemies if it would eliminate the Eastern Front. Lenin's April theses, calling for immediate peace, redistribution of land to the peasants, and transfer of power to the Soviets, offered simple solutions to Russia's complex problems. His slogan, "Peace, Land, Bread," resonated with a population that had endured 3 years of war, famine, and social upheaval. While other political leaders spoke of duty, honor, and constitutional processes, Lenin promised immediate relief from the sufferings that had brought down the old regime. The Bolsheviks' rise to power was neither inevitable nor immediate. They remained a minority party even within the broader socialist movement, and their extreme positions initially alienated many Russians who wanted reform rather than revolution. But Lenin's tactical genius lay in understanding that in a time of complete chaos, a small, disciplined organization with clear objectives could seize power from larger but divided opponents. The failure of the Kerensky offensive in July 1917 sealed the fate of both the provisional government and Russia's continued participation in the war. This last desperate attempt to restore Russian military credibility resulted in another catastrophic defeat, with entire divisions simply melting away as soldiers voted with their feet against continuing the war. The offensive's failure destroyed whatever remained of the government's credibility and gave the Bolsheviks their opening to seize power. While Russia convulsed with revolution, the Western Allies faced their own crisis of morale and resources. The French army, bled white at Verdun and exhausted by repeated offensives, erupted in widespread mutinies following the disastrous Nivelle offensive in April 1917. General Robert Nivelle had promised a breakthrough within 48 hours, claiming that his new tactics would finally break the deadlock on the Western Front. Instead, his attacks shattered against German defenses like waves against a stone wall, costing France another 187,000 casualties for minimal gains. The French mutinies that followed were not acts of cowardice or treason, but expressions of a profound war weariness that had infected the entire army. Soldiers were willing to defend their trenches, but refused to participate in further offensive operations that seemed designed primarily to satisfy the ambitions of generals who never shared the risks they imposed on their men. The mutinies spread to over half the French army before being contained through a combination of limited concessions and selective executions. General Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, replaced Nivelle and began the delicate process of rebuilding French morale while maintaining defensive positions. Pétain understood that the French army needed time to recover its fighting spirit, and that further major offensives would likely trigger complete collapse. His policy of defensive warfare bought France time, but it also placed enormous pressure on Britain to carry the primary burden of offensive operations on the Western Front. The British Empire was straining under burdens that would have been unimaginable in 1914. Casualties had reached levels that shocked even military leaders accustomed to the arithmetic of modern warfare. The Battle of Passchendaele, fought in the autumn of 1917, became synonymous with the futility of trench warfare as British and Canadian forces advanced through mud so deep that wounded men drowned in shell craters before stretcher bearers could reach them. The submarine war had reached crisis proportions by early 1917, with German U-boats sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced. Britain, dependent on imports for both food and raw materials, faced the real possibility of starvation if the submarine offensive continued at its current pace. The German calculation was simple. If they could sink 600,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, Britain would be forced to sue for peace within 6 months. For a time, it seemed the German gamble might succeed. U-boat attacks reached their peak in April 1917, when over 860,000 tons of Allied shipping was sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. British food reserves dwindled to just 6 weeks' supply, and rationing was introduced for the first time in the nation's history. The Royal Navy, master of the seas for over a century, seemed powerless to prevent the slow strangulation of the British Isles. Salvation came through the gradual implementation of the convoy system. Despite initial resistance from naval traditionalists, who believed that grouping merchant ships together would simply provide U-boats with more concentrated targets. The reality proved quite different. Convoys were much harder to locate than individual ships, and the concentration of escort vessels made attacking them extremely dangerous for submarine commanders. The convoy system's success was aided by crucial intelligence breakthroughs. British cryptographers had cracked German naval codes, allowing them to route convoys away from known U-boat positions. Anti-submarine warfare techniques improved rapidly, as depth charges, hydrophones, and other detection methods made submarine operations increasingly hazardous. By the end of 1917, the U-boat threat, while still serious, was no longer capable of bringing Britain to its knees. The most significant development of 1917, however, was the entry of the United States into the war. America's declaration of war in April came after years of maintaining precarious neutrality, while the European powers tore each other apart. President Wilson had won re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," but German submarine attacks on American shipping and the infamous Zimmermann telegram, proposing a German-Mexican alliance against the United States, finally pushed American public opinion beyond the point of neutrality. The Zimmermann telegram, intercepted and decoded by British intelligence, revealed German plans to seek Mexican support in case of war with America, offering to help Mexico reclaim Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico in exchange for joining the Central Powers. When this diplomatic bombshell was published in American newspapers, it created a wave of anti-German sentiment that made American entry into the war almost inevitable. Wilson's war message to Congress on April 2, 1917, transformed the conflict from a European balance of power struggle into a crusade for democratic values. "The world must be made safe for democracy," he declared, giving the war a moral dimension that would reshape both American foreign policy and international relations for decades to come. The United States was entering the war not for territorial gain or national advantage, but to defend principles that Wilson believed were universal human values. The American war effort began slowly, hampered by the enormous task of converting a peaceful nation into a military power capable of affecting the outcome of a global conflict. The United States Army in 1917 was smaller than Belgium's had been in 1914, and American industry, while immensely productive, was geared towards civilian rather than military production. The challenge of raising, training, equipping, and transporting an army of millions across the Atlantic, while simultaneously building the industrial infrastructure to support them, was unprecedented in scope. General John J. Pershing, selected to command the American Expeditionary Force, faced enormous pressure from Allied leaders to feed American troops into existing French and British units as replacements for their heavy casualties. Pershing resisted these demands, insisting that American forces fight as an independent army under American command. This decision, controversial at the time, preserved American military identity and ensured that the United States would have a distinct voice in any peace negotiations. The industrial mobilization of America proceeded with characteristic energy and innovation. The War Industries Board coordinated production priorities, while the Committee on Public Information launched the most sophisticated propaganda campaign the world had yet seen. Liberty Loan drives raised billions of dollars through the sale of war bonds, while Hollywood studios produced films depicting German atrocities and American heroism. The entire American economy was reorganized for war production with remarkable speed and efficiency. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, a different kind of warfare was reshaping the political map of entire regions. The Arab Revolt, encouraged by British agents like T.E. Lawrence, had evolved from scattered raids into a coordinated campaign against Ottoman rule. Lawrence himself became a romantic figure whose exploits in the desert seemed to recall an earlier age of adventure and individual heroism, a sharp contrast to the mechanized slaughter of the Western Front. The British offensive in Palestine, led by General Edmund Allenby, combined traditional cavalry tactics with modern technology to achieve some of the war's most dramatic territorial gains. The capture of Jerusalem in December 1917 provided the British Empire with a significant propaganda victory and seemed to fulfill biblical prophecies about the Holy Land's liberation. Allenby's entry into Jerusalem on foot, in contrast to Kaiser Wilhelm's mounted entry years earlier, was carefully choreographed to emphasize British respect for the city's religious significance. The Balfour Declaration, issued in November 1917, promised British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, fundamentally altering the political future of the Middle East. This commitment, made partly to secure Jewish support for the war effort and partly to justify British control of Palestine, would create conflicts that persist to this day. The declaration reflected the war's tendency to reshape not just the present, but the future, as desperate governments made promises they might not be able to keep. In Germany, the strain of fighting a two-front war while under naval blockade was beginning to show in ways that would have been unthinkable in 1914. The turnip winter of 1916-1917 had seen civilian food rations reduced to near starvation levels as the British blockade slowly strangled German imports. Industrial production was declining as raw materials became scarce and the workforce was depleted by military conscription. The German government responded by implementing increasingly draconian measures to maintain war production. The Auxiliary Service Law of 1916 essentially militarized the entire German economy, giving military authorities control over civilian production and labor allocation. Workers could be forbidden to change jobs, while factory owners were required to meet production quotas regardless of cost or working conditions. These measures succeeded in maintaining German military strength in the short term, but at the cost of storing up social tensions that would ultimately prove explosive. German workers, subjected to military discipline while their living standards collapsed, began to organize strikes and protests despite harsh penalties. The Social Democratic Party, initially supportive of the war effort, split as its radical wing demanded immediate peace negotiations. The German High Command, recognizing that time was running against them, made the fateful decision to transfer substantial forces from the Eastern Front to launch one final offensive in the West before American reinforcements could tip the balance decisively. The collapse of Russia offered Germany its last opportunity to achieve victory through military means, but success would require speed, perfect coordination, and more than a little luck. As 1917 drew to a close, the war had fundamentally altered the character of all the major combatant nations. Russia was sliding toward complete revolutionary chaos that would soon take it out of the war entirely. France had survived its crisis of morale, but remained dependent on British and increasingly American support. Britain had weathered the submarine threat, but was financially exhausted and dependent on American loans. Germany retained formidable military strength, but was slowly being strangled by blockade and facing the prospect of American reinforcements that would make victory impossible. The United States was mobilizing resources on a scale that dwarfed all previous military efforts, but those resources would take time to reach the battlefield in decisive quantities. The war that had begun as a European conflict had become a global struggle involving nations and peoples from every continent. The outcome would determine not just the political map of Europe, but the fundamental character of the 20th century. The stage was set for 1918, the year that would finally resolve the greatest conflict in human history. But that resolution would come only after one final spasm of violence that would push all the combatant nations to the very limits of their endurance, testing whether modern civilization could survive the forces of destruction it had unleashed upon itself. The armies that would clash in 1918 bore little resemblance to the forces that had marched to war with such confidence 4 years earlier. Gone were the brightly colored uniforms, the cavalry charges, the romantic notions of warfare that had sustained European military tradition for centuries. In their place stood battle-hardened veterans who had learned to survive in a landscape that resembled no earthly hell previously imagined by human minds. The German soldiers preparing for what their high command called the peace offensive were a study in contradictions. They possessed tactical skills honed by years of defensive warfare, innovative stormtrooper techniques that had revolutionized infantry combat, and weapon systems that represented the cutting edge of military technology. Yet they were also hollow-eyed from malnutrition, their uniforms patched with whatever materials could be found, their equipment showing the wear of a nation slowly starving under blockade. These men had witnessed the collapse of the Eastern Front, had seen entire Russian armies simply dissolve as revolution consumed their enemy from within. They knew this represented Germany's last opportunity to achieve victory before American industrial might could tip the scales irrevocably against them. The transfer of 44 divisions from east to west had given Germany numerical superiority on the Western Front for the first time since 1914, but everyone understood this advantage was temporary. American troops were arriving in France at a rate of 250,000 per month, and each passing day made German victory less likely. General Erich Ludendorff, the brilliant but increasingly unstable architect of German strategy, had staked everything on a series of offensives designed to break the Western Front before summer arrived. His stormtrooper tactics, developed through painful trial and error on the Eastern Front, represented a revolution in military thinking. Instead of massive preliminary bombardments that warned the enemy of impending attack, German artillery would deliver short, intense barrages using precise fire control to neutralize specific targets. Infantry would advance not in waves but in small groups, bypassing strong points and penetrating deep into enemy territory before consolidating their gains. The first blow fell on March 21st along a 50-mile front near the old Somme battlefield. Operation Michael, as the Germans called it, achieved tactical surprise on a scale not seen since 1914. British positions that had seemed impregnable were overrun in hours as stormtroopers infiltrated through morning fog that concealed their movements. Entire divisions simply vanished as German spearheads penetrated 40 miles into Allied territory. The the deepest advance on the Western Front since the opening months of the war. For a brief moment, it seemed that Ludendorff's gamble might succeed. German troops advanced faster than their own supply lines could follow, capturing enormous quantities of British equipment and thousands of prisoners. Paris came under long-range artillery fire from massive German guns positioned 75 miles away, creating panic among civilians who had thought themselves safe behind the static front lines. The sound of German shells exploding in the French capital served as a stark reminder that this war could still reach into the heart of Allied territory. Yet even as German forces achieved unprecedented tactical success, strategic problems were becoming apparent. The stormtrooper tactics that had broken through Allied positions left German forces scattered across a wide front without clear objectives. Ludendorff had planned to separate British and French forces, forcing them to retreat in different directions, but the Allies managed to maintain contact despite heavy losses. Most critically, the German advance was consuming the reserves that would be needed for subsequent operations. The human cost of the offensive was staggering even by the standards of the Western Front. German casualties in the first 3 days exceeded 240,000 men, losses that the Reich could ill afford despite its temporary numerical advantage. British losses were equally severe, with entire territorial divisions ceasing to exist as coherent fighting units. The old Somme battlefield, which had consumed so many lives in 1916, was once again soaked with blood as a new generation of soldiers paid the price for their general's ambitions. General Ferdinand Foch, the newly appointed Allied Supreme Commander, demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that had been largely absent from previous years of the war. Rather than rushing reinforcements piecemeal to threatened sectors, he maintained a central reserve that could be deployed where it would have maximum impact. His famous declaration, "My center is giving way, my right is retreating, situation excellent, I am attacking," captured the kind of offensive spirit that would ultimately turn the tide against German advances. The Second German Offensive, launched in April along the Lys River, initially achieved similar success to Operation Michael. British forces, still reeling from their earlier losses, gave ground rapidly as German troops advanced toward the Channel ports that were vital to British supply lines. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, the British commander whose reputation had been tarnished by the failures at Passchendaele, issued his famous backs-to-the-wall order, calling on every man to fight to the death rather than permit German victory. But the pattern was becoming clear. German offensives could achieve spectacular initial success, penetrating Allied lines and capturing territory that had been fought over for years. However, these advances inevitably slowed as supply lines lengthened, casualties mounted, and reserves were exhausted. The Allies, despite heavy losses, retained the ability to bring up fresh troops and establish new defensive positions. Most importantly, American reinforcements were arriving in ever-increasing numbers, providing the manpower needed to replace casualties and launch counteroffensives. The Third German Offensive, directed against French positions along the Chemin des Dames, brought German forces to within 40 miles of Paris for the second time in the war. French civilians who had endured 4 years of war found themselves once again preparing for possible occupation, while government officials made contingency plans for evacuation to Bordeaux. The psychological impact was enormous, but the strategic situation remained fundamentally unchanged. Germany was expending its last reserves in pursuit of objectives that, even if achieved, might not prove decisive. The arrival of American forces in significant numbers was beginning to affect not just the balance of manpower, but the character of the war itself. These fresh troops, unburdened by 4 years of trench warfare psychology, brought an aggressive spirit that contrasted sharply with the war weariness of European armies. General John J. Pershing's insistence on maintaining American units under American command was beginning to pay dividends as the AEF developed its own tactical doctrines and fighting reputation. The Battle of Belleau Wood in June 1918 became an early test of American fighting ability and determination. U.S. Marines, fighting alongside French forces, launched repeated attacks against German positions with a ferocity that impressed even veteran European observers. The Marines' famous battle cry, "Come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?" captured the spirit that American forces brought to a war that had long since lost its romantic appeal for European participants. The German offensives had achieved tactical success, but strategic failure. Ludendorff had gambled everything on breaking Allied resistance before American reinforcements could arrive in decisive numbers, but that gamble was clearly failing. German casualties in the spring offensives exceeded 800,000 men, losses that could not be replaced from a population already stretched to its limits. The German army that had begun 1918 with such high hopes was being systematically destroyed in pursuit of objectives that remained frustratingly out of reach. Behind the front lines, German society was showing signs of collapse that would have been unthinkable even a year earlier. The naval blockade, tightened by American participation, had reduced civilian rations to starvation levels. Industrial production was declining as raw materials became unavailable, and the workforce was depleted by military conscription. Most ominously, the influenza pandemic that was sweeping the globe was taking a particularly heavy toll on a German population weakened by years of malnutrition. The pandemic, which would ultimately kill more people than the war itself, struck all the combatant nations with devastating force. Military units, with their crowded living conditions and constant movement of personnel, proved particularly vulnerable to the disease. Entire divisions were rendered combat ineffective, not by enemy action, but by a microscopic enemy that recognized no national boundaries or military ranks. In Germany, the combination of military defeat, civilian suffering, and pandemic disease was creating the conditions for revolution. Workers' strikes, initially focused on economic grievances, were taking on increasingly political dimensions. The Social Democratic Party, which had supported the war effort in 1914, was splitting as its radical wing demanded immediate peace negotiations and democratic reforms. Even more ominously, sailors in the German fleet were beginning to show signs of mutiny as they questioned orders to sortie for what seemed like a suicidal final battle against the Royal Navy. The Allies, despite their growing advantages, were also showing signs of strain. French morale, carefully rebuilt by Pétain after the 1917 mutinies, was being tested once again by German advances that had erased years of hard-won territorial gains. British forces, bled white by 4 years of offensive operations, were increasingly dependent on Imperial troops from Canada, Australia, and South Africa to maintain fighting strength. Even the Americans, with their vast reserves of manpower and material, were discovering that modern warfare consumed resources at rates that challenged even their industrial capacity. Yet the fundamental strategic situation was shifting inexorably in favor of the Allies. American industrial production was reaching levels that dwarfed anything previously achieved in human history. Liberty ships were being produced faster than German submarines could sink them, while American factories were turning out aircraft, artillery, and ammunition in quantities that German planners had thought impossible. Most importantly, American troop strength in France was approaching 2 million men, with more arriving every month. The technological war was also evolving rapidly, as both sides sought advantages that might break the deadlock. Aircraft had evolved from simple reconnaissance platforms into sophisticated weapons systems capable of ground attack, strategic bombing, and air superiority missions. The first true fighter aces had emerged from the aerial battles over the Western Front, creating a new form of warfare that seemed to recapture some of the individual heroism that had been lost in the mechanized slaughter below. Tank warfare was coming of age as engineers solved the reliability problems that had plagued early models. The British had developed tactics for using tanks in large formations, supported by aircraft and artillery, that promised to restore mobility to battlefield operations. The Germans, despite their tactical innovations, had failed to develop effective anti-tank weapons or to produce tanks in sufficient numbers to counter Allied armor. Artillery, the dominant weapon of the Western Front, was reaching new levels of sophistication as fire control techniques improved and ammunition became more specialized. Gas shells, high explosive rounds, and shrapnel were being used in carefully coordinated barrages that could suppress defenders, destroy obstacles, and support infantry advances with unprecedented precision. The art of gunnery had evolved from simple bombardment to complex orchestration of fire that required mathematical calculation and split-second timing. Communication systems, primitive in 1914, had evolved into networks that could coordinate operations across vast distances. Telephone lines, wireless telegraphy, and even primitive radio systems allowed commanders to maintain contact with subordinate units and respond to changing battlefield conditions. The fog of war, while never eliminated, was being gradually lifted by technological innovations that gave military leaders better information about enemy positions and friendly force locations. As summer arrived in 1918, both sides were preparing for what many sensed would be the final phase of the conflict. The German High Command, recognizing that their offensive capacity was nearly exhausted, was planning one last desperate attempt to achieve decisive victory before American reinforcements made success impossible. The Allies, sensing German weakness, were preparing their own offensives designed to exploit the gaps torn in German defenses by the spring campaigns. The stage was set for the climactic battles that would finally resolve the greatest conflict in human history. 4 years of unprecedented warfare had transformed not just military tactics, but the very nature of human society. The world that would emerge from this final phase of fighting would bear little resemblance to the confident, optimistic civilization that had stumbled into war in 1914. The old order was dying in the mud of France, and from its ashes would rise a new world shaped by the traumatic lessons of total war. The summer of 1918 would test every assumption about warfare, society, and human endurance that had sustained European civilization for centuries. Victory, when it finally came, would belong not to the side with the most skillful generals or the bravest soldiers, but to the nation that could best endure the unprecedented demands of industrial warfare. The final chapters of the Great War were about to be written in blood and steel across the battlefields of Western Europe. The turning point came not with the thunderous crash of artillery or the heroic charge of cavalry, but with something far more prosaic yet infinitely more decisive: logistics. By July 1918, the mathematical realities of modern warfare were asserting themselves with inexorable force. Every German advance had stretched supply lines thinner, consumed irreplaceable reserves, and brought American reinforcements closer to full deployment. The stormtroopers who had achieved such spectacular breakthroughs in the spring were now hollow-eyed shadows of their former selves, their elite units decimated by months of continuous combat. General Ludendorff, the architect of Germany's final gamble, found himself trapped in a strategic nightmare of his own making. His offensives had created a series of exposed salients that required enormous numbers of troops to defend. Yet those same troops were needed for future attacks. The German army was being stretched like elastic, and everyone could sense it was approaching its breaking point. Intelligence reports painted an increasingly grim picture. American divisions were arriving faster than German casualties could be replaced. Allied artillery was growing more accurate and devastating with each passing week, and most ominously, German morale was beginning to crack under the strain of prolonged combat without decisive results. The final German offensive, launched on July 15th along the Marne River, represented Ludendorff's last desperate attempt to achieve victory before the strategic balance shifted permanently against Germany. This attack, which history would remember as the Second Battle of the Marne, began with familiar success as German stormtroopers penetrated Allied positions and advanced several miles into French territory. But something was different this time. The Allies had learned to read German tactical patterns, positioning their defenses in depth and preparing immediate counterattacks that would exploit German momentum against them. French intelligence had broken German radio codes, providing advance warning of the offensive's timing and objectives. General Ferdinand Foch, the Allied supreme commander, had positioned his reserves carefully, waiting for the German advance to exhaust itself before launching coordinated counterstrikes. Most significantly, American divisions were now available in numbers sufficient to affect the battle's outcome, bringing fresh energy and aggressive tactics to sectors where European armies had fought themselves to exhaustion. The German advance lasted exactly 3 days before grinding to a halt in the face of determined resistance and devastating artillery fire. On July 18th, Foch launched his counteroffensive with a massive assault spearheaded by French colonial troops, British divisions, and 2 full American corps. The Germans, caught in the open with extended supply lines and depleted reserves, found themselves in the unfamiliar position of conducting a fighting withdrawal under constant pressure from enemies who seemed to possess unlimited resources. For the first time since 1914, German forces were retreating not as a tactical maneuver, but from strategic necessity. The psychological impact was enormous, both on German troops who had been told they were winning the war, and on Allied soldiers who had endured 4 years of stalemate and defeat. The sight of German prisoners marching westward in long columns, many appearing relieved to be out of the fighting, provided tangible evidence that the enemy was finally weakening. The retreat that began at the Marne quickly spread along the entire Western Front, as German commanders recognized that their exposed positions were becoming indefensible. The Hindenburg Line, that supposedly impregnable system of fortifications that had anchored German defenses for 3 years, was gradually being abandoned as troops fell back to more defensible positions. Villages and towns that had been under German occupation since 1914 were suddenly liberated, their inhabitants emerging from cellars and hiding places to witness scenes they had barely dared to imagine. Marshal Foch, sensing that the moment had arrived to exploit German weakness, coordinated a series of offensives that would become known as the 100 Days Campaign. These attacks, launched by British, French, Canadian, Australian, and American forces along different sectors of the front, were designed to maintain constant pressure on German defenses while preventing the enemy from concentrating reserves at any single threatened point. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Instead of seeking decisive breakthrough at one location, the Allies would attack everywhere simultaneously, forcing the Germans to defend an impossibly long front with increasingly inadequate resources. The Battle of Amiens, launched by British and Canadian forces on August 8th, achieved the kind of breakthrough that had eluded Allied commanders for 4 years. Tanks, aircraft, and artillery worked in unprecedented coordination to punch through German lines and advance 8 miles in a single day. Ludendorff would later describe August 8th as the Black Day of the German army, but the significance went beyond tactical defeat. For the first time, German units had surrendered en masse rather than fighting to the last man, suggesting that the legendary discipline of the German military machine was finally cracking under pressure. The Canadian Corps, fighting with particular distinction at Amiens, demonstrated how Dominion forces had evolved from colonial auxiliaries into elite assault troops. Their tactical innovations, combining small unit tactics with sophisticated fire support, represented the culmination of 4 years of hard-won experience. Canadian success was matched by Australian achievements at Mont Saint-Quentin, where Anzac forces captured positions that German engineers had considered impregnable. These victories by Imperial troops carried special significance, proving that the British Empire could still produce soldiers capable of defeating the best that Germany could field. American forces were also coming into their own as effective combat units. The reduction of the Saint-Mihiel salient in September, the first major operation conducted entirely under American command, eliminated a German position that had threatened Allied communications for 4 years. General Pershing's insistence on maintaining American tactical independence was vindicated as his divisions demonstrated that they could plan and execute complex operations without European tutelage. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, launched by American forces in late September, became the largest battle in United States military history. Over 1 million American soldiers participated in this grinding campaign to break through the strongest section of the Hindenburg Line. The fighting was brutal, with American casualties exceeding 26,000 killed and 95,000 wounded, but the offensive succeeded in its strategic objective of preventing German forces from conducting an orderly withdrawal to prepared positions. The human drama of these final battles was intensified by the knowledge that the war's end was approaching. Soldiers on both sides fought with desperate intensity, knowing that death in the last weeks of conflict would be particularly tragic. Letters home reflected this tension, with men expressing both hope for survival and resignation to fate. The influenza pandemic, raging through military camps and civilian populations alike, added another layer of uncertainty to lives already shaped by the constant presence of death. Behind the German lines, the social order that had sustained 4 years of total war was disintegrating with alarming speed. Civilians in major cities were surviving on rations that provided fewer calories than were needed for basic sustenance. Industrial production was collapsing as raw materials became unavailable, and workers grew too weak from malnutrition to perform physically demanding tasks. The transportation system, overburdened by military requirements and lacking adequate fuel, was breaking down completely. The German Navy, confined to port by British naval superiority and consumed by revolutionary ferment, was becoming a liability rather than an asset. Sailors who had endured years of inactivity while their army comrades fought and died were increasingly receptive to radical political ideas. When naval commanders finally ordered the fleet to sortie for one last desperate battle against the Royal Navy, the crews mutinied rather than participate in what they correctly perceived as a suicidal gesture. The naval mutiny at Kiel in late October 1918 sparked revolutionary uprisings throughout Germany. Workers' and soldiers' councils, modeled on the Russian Soviets, began seizing control of major cities. The authority of the Kaiser and his government was evaporating as dramatically as that of the Tsar had collapsed the previous year. Unlike Russia, however, Germany's revolution was driven not by ideological fervor, but by simple exhaustion and the desire for peace at any cost. Kaiser Wilhelm II, that bombastic monarch whose diplomatic blunders had helped precipitate the war, found himself increasingly isolated as even his most loyal supporters began to distance themselves from his regime. The German High Command, recognizing that military victory was impossible and that continued fighting would only worsen the terms of any eventual peace settlement, began secret negotiations for an armistice. These discussions, conducted through neutral intermediaries, revealed how completely German strategy had collapsed in the space of just a few months. President Woodrow Wilson, thrust into the role of mediator between the warring powers, seized the opportunity to reshape the post-war world according to his vision of democratic peace. His 14 points, originally presented as American war aims, became the basis for armistice negotiations and would ultimately influence the peace settlement in ways that would affect international relations for decades to come. Wilson's insistence on democratic government as a precondition for peace negotiations effectively forced the abdication of the Kaiser and the establishment of a German republic. The armistice negotiations themselves revealed the extent of German desperation. Terms that would have been unthinkable even 6 months earlier were accepted without significant protest. Evacuation of all occupied territory, surrender of submarines and aircraft, internment of the surface fleet, and occupation of German territory west of the Rhine. The German delegation, led by Matthias Erzberger, signed these humiliating conditions because the alternative was continued warfare that could only result in complete national destruction. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent along the Western Front. The sound of that silence, after 4 years of continuous artillery fire, was more profound than any noise the war had produced. Soldiers on both sides emerged from their trenches, many unable to believe that the killing had actually stopped. Some units continued fighting until the very last minute, adding final casualties to casualty lists that already contained over 10 million names. The armistice was technically just a cessation of hostilities, not a formal peace treaty, but everyone understood that the war was effectively over. Germany had been defeated not through invasion or occupation of its homeland, but through the collapse of its ability to continue fighting. The Central Powers had been worn down by blockade, exhausted by casualties, and overwhelmed by the industrial capacity of their enemies. It was a new kind of victory in a new kind of war, achieved through endurance rather than heroism, through production rather than inspiration. The immediate aftermath of the armistice was chaotic, as millions of soldiers began the complex process of demobilization. Men who had lived for years in the artificial environment of military service now faced the challenge of returning to civilian societies that had been transformed by their absence. Many would find that the homes they had fought to defend no longer existed in any recognizable form, while others would discover that they themselves had been so changed by their experiences that normal peacetime life seemed impossible to achieve. The influenza pandemic, which had killed more people worldwide than the war itself, continued its deadly harvest even as the fighting ended. Military hospitals, already overwhelmed by battle casualties, now faced waves of victims from a disease that seemed particularly deadly to young adults in their prime. The irony was bitter. Many who had survived years of combat would die from an enemy that could not be fought with weapons or defeated through courage. As news of the armistice spread around the world, celebrations erupted in Allied capitals while German cities remained ominously quiet. In London, Paris, and New York, crowds gathered in the streets to celebrate victory and mourn the dead in complex emotions that combined relief, joy, and profound sadness. Church bells rang, sirens wailed, and people danced in public squares. But the celebrations were tempered by the knowledge of what the victory had cost. The war that had begun with such confidence and optimism in 1914 had ended with European civilization fundamentally transformed. 4 great empires, German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman, had collapsed, creating a power vacuum that would reshape international relations for generations. The map of Europe would need to be redrawn, new nations would emerge from the wreckage of old empires, and the survivors would face the daunting task of building a peaceful world from the ashes of unprecedented destruction. The soldiers returning from the trenches carried with them not just physical wounds, but psychological scars that would affect their societies for decades to come. They had witnessed the mechanization of death, the industrialization of warfare, and the collapse of traditional values that had sustained European civilization for centuries. Their experiences would influence literature, art, politics, and social movements in ways that would define the remainder of the 20th century. The Great War, as it came to be known, had ended, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. The peace settlement that would follow would create new conflicts even as it resolved old ones, establishing patterns of international relations that would ultimately lead to an even more devastating global conflict just 20 years later. The world that emerged from the trenches of France would be haunted by the ghosts of the millions who had died in what was supposed to be the war to end all wars. The silence that descended over the Western Front on November 11, 1918, was more profound than any sound the war had produced. After 51 months of continuous artillery bombardment, the absence of gunfire created an almost physical presence, a void that seemed to press against the eardrums of soldiers who had grown accustomed to the constant thunder of modern warfare. Men emerged from their trenches like creatures surfacing from some subterranean world, blinking in the pale autumn sunlight and struggling to comprehend that the killing had actually stopped. In those first moments of peace, the surreal nature of the transition became apparent. French soldiers who had been firing at German positions just hours earlier now stood in no man's land, sharing cigarettes and chocolate with enemies who suddenly seemed like fellow survivors of an incomprehensible ordeal. British officers found themselves shaking hands with German counterparts across shell craters that had been the sites of desperate battles just days before. The artificial hatreds that propaganda had worked so hard to cultivate seemed to evaporate in the face of shared exhaustion and mutual recognition of what they had all endured. Yet even as the guns fell silent, the machinery of war continued grinding forward with mechanical persistence. Supply trains still rolled toward the front, carrying ammunition that would never be fired. Artillery pieces remained trained on targets that would never again be shelled. In hospitals behind the lines, surgeons continued operating on the wounded, while nurses tended to men whose injuries represented the final casualties of a conflict that had already claimed more lives than any previous war in human history. The armistice terms themselves revealed the completeness of German defeat in ways that would have profound consequences for the future of Europe. Beyond the immediate military requirements, evacuation of occupied territories, surrender of weapons, internment of the fleet, lay more subtle but equally significant provisions that would reshape the balance of power across the continent. The occupation of German territory west of the Rhine created a buffer zone that placed French forces within striking distance of Germany's industrial heartland. The surrender of locomotives and railroad cars crippled Germany's ability to maintain economic life, while the continuation of the naval blockade ensured that civilian suffering would persist even after military operations had ceased. These harsh conditions reflected not just military necessity, but a fundamental shift in how civilized nations understood the nature of warfare itself. The concept of limited war, where professional armies fought for specific political objectives while civilian populations remained largely untouched, had been buried forever in the trenches of France. Total war had demanded total victory, and total victory required the complete subordination of the defeated enemy. The gentlemanly conventions that had governed European conflicts for centuries had been swept away by the mechanized brutality of industrial warfare. The German delegation that signed the armistice in Marshal Foch's railway car in the forest of Compiègne understood that they were accepting terms that went far beyond military defeat. They were acknowledging the collapse of the social and political order that had sustained the German Empire for nearly half a century. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the bombastic monarch whose diplomatic blunders had helped precipitate the crisis, had already fled to neutral Holland, abandoning his throne and his people to face the consequences of decisions he had been instrumental in making. The revolution that swept through Germany in those final weeks of the war bore little resemblance to the carefully orchestrated Bolshevik takeover in Russia. Instead of ideological zealots seizing power according to predetermined plans, Germany witnessed the spontaneous collapse of authority as exhausted populations simply stopped obeying orders from leaders who had proven themselves catastrophically incompetent. Workers' and soldiers' councils sprang up in major cities not because they had been organized by revolutionary parties, but because someone needed to maintain basic services while the old government apparatus disintegrated. The naval mutiny at Kiel that had sparked this revolutionary wave revealed how completely the war had undermined traditional German discipline and hierarchy. Sailors who had endured 4 years of enforced idleness while their army comrades died in the trenches were no longer willing to sacrifice themselves for a cause that even their officers privately acknowledged was hopeless. When Admiral Scheer ordered the High Seas Fleet to sortie for one final battle against the Royal Navy, the crews correctly perceived this as a suicide mission designed to preserve naval honor at the cost of their lives. Similar patterns of collapse were evident throughout the Central Powers. Austria-Hungary, that ramshackle empire of competing nationalities, simply dissolved as its constituent peoples declared independence and established their own national governments. The Czechs proclaimed their independence in Prague, while Slovaks joined them in creating Czechoslovakia. Hungarians repudiated their union with Austria and established their own republic under Count Mihaly Károlyi. South Slavs united to form Yugoslavia, fulfilling dreams of pan-Slavic unity that had helped trigger the war 4 years earlier. The Ottoman Empire faced similar disintegration as Arab nationalism, encouraged by British agents like T.E. Lawrence, continued its revolt against Turkish rule. The Young Turk government that had led the empire into war had already fled Constantinople, leaving behind a power vacuum that would be filled by nationalist forces under Mustafa Kemal. The sick man of Europe, as the Ottoman Empire had been called for decades, was finally succumbing to ailments that the war had made terminal. For the victorious Allied powers, the end of fighting brought challenges almost as complex as those they had faced during the war itself. Millions of soldiers needed to be demobilized and reintegrated into civilian economies that had been fundamentally altered by 4 years of wartime production. Women who had entered factories to replace men fighting at the front now faced pressure to return to traditional domestic roles, creating social tensions that would reshape gender relations throughout the Western world. The economic disruption caused by demobilization was particularly severe in industries that had expanded dramatically to meet wartime demand. Munitions factories that had employed hundreds of thousands of workers faced the prospect of massive layoffs as military contracts were canceled overnight. Shipyards that had produced vessels at unprecedented rates suddenly found themselves without orders. The challenge of converting these industrial facilities to peacetime production while avoiding mass unemployment would test the administrative skills of governments that had learned to manage total war but had little experience with managing total peace. The human cost of demobilization extended far beyond economic concerns. Soldiers returning from the trenches carried with them not just visible wounds, but psychological trauma that military medicine was only beginning to understand. Shell shock, as it was then called, affected hundreds of thousands of veterans who found themselves unable to adjust to civilian life after years of exposure to mechanized violence. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, anxiety, and an inability to form normal social relationships. The impact on families was equally profound. Wives who had managed households independently for years now faced the return of husbands who seemed like strangers. Children who had grown up without fathers struggled to establish relationships with men whose experiences had taken them far beyond anything civilian life could offer. The divorce rate spiked in many countries as couples discovered that the people they had married before the war no longer existed in any recognizable form. Veterans found themselves caught between worlds, unable to communicate their experiences to civilians who had not shared them, while simultaneously being unable to forget what they had witnessed. The gap between those who had served and those who had remained at home became a defining feature of post-war society, creating a generation of men who felt isolated from the very civilization they had fought to defend. The influenza pandemic that swept the globe in 1918 and 1919 added another layer of tragedy to the war's conclusion. This biological enemy proved even more deadly than the military conflict, killing an estimated 50 million people worldwide, more than twice the number who had died in combat. The pandemic struck with particular virulence in military camps and aboard troop ships, where crowded conditions and the movement of personnel created ideal circumstances for the virus to spread. Medical authorities, already overwhelmed by battle casualties, found themselves facing a completely different kind of emergency. Hospitals that had learned to treat gunshot wounds and gas poisoning were helpless against a disease that killed healthy young adults within days of infection. The irony was bitter. Many who had survived years of combat succumbed to an enemy that could not be defeated through courage or superior tactics. The pandemic's impact on the peace negotiations was significant, though often overlooked. President Wilson, weakened by influenza during the crucial stages of the Paris Peace Conference, may have been less effective in advocating for his vision of a just and lasting settlement. Several key delegates suffered from the disease, affecting their ability to participate fully in discussions that would reshape the post-war world. As the immediate crisis of war's end gave way to longer-term planning for peace, the magnitude of the reconstruction challenge became apparent. Entire regions of France and Belgium had been devastated by 4 years of combat, their towns destroyed, their agricultural land poisoned by chemicals and littered with unexploded ordnance. The famous Red Zone in northeastern France was so thoroughly contaminated with munitions and human remains that it was declared uninhabitable, a permanent scar on the landscape that served as a monument to the war's destructive power. The economic cost of reconstruction was staggering. France alone faced bills for rebuilding that exceeded the total value of the national economy before the war. Britain, despite avoiding invasion, had accumulated debts that would burden the nation for decades. The United States, ironically, emerged from the conflict as the world's leading creditor nation, having financed much of the Allied war effort through loans that would now need to be repaid by devastated European economies. The social changes wrought by the war were equally profound and permanent. Traditional class structures had been shaken by the shared sacrifice of military service and the upward mobility created by wartime economic opportunities. Aristocratic families that had dominated European society for centuries found their sons lying alongside peasants and factory workers in military cemeteries. The democratic ideals that Wilson had proclaimed as war aims were becoming social realities, as returning veterans demanded political rights commensurate with their service. Women's roles had been transformed by their participation in the war effort. The right to vote, which had been a radical demand before 1914, became an accepted consequence of women's contributions to victory. Traditional assumptions about feminine weakness and unsuitability for public life had been shattered by the evidence of women's competence in factories, hospitals, and administrative offices. The world that emerged from the war would be one where gender relations operated according to fundamentally different principles. The intellectual and cultural impact of the war was perhaps even more significant than its political and economic consequences. The confident optimism that had characterized European civilization before 1914 had been replaced by profound uncertainty about human progress and the benefits of technological advancement. Writers, artists, and philosophers struggled to find meaning in a world that had demonstrated humanity's capacity for unprecedented destruction. The literature that emerged from the trenches bore little resemblance to the heroic war poetry of earlier eras. Instead of celebrating glory and honor, writers like Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, and Erich Maria Remarque depicted war as senseless slaughter that destroyed both the bodies and souls of its participants. Their work would shape public understanding of warfare for generations, creating a cultural memory that emphasized suffering rather than achievement. Visual artists likewise abandoned traditional representations of martial glory in favor of more disturbing imagery that captured the mechanized horror of modern combat. The paintings of Otto Dix and George Grosz showed war's impact on human bodies and psyches with unflinching honesty that challenged viewers to confront uncomfortable truths about the civilization that had produced such destruction. The religious implications of the war were equally profound. The comfortable Christianity that had blessed national armies and proclaimed God's favor for competing sides now faced difficult questions about divine justice and human suffering. Many veterans returned from the trenches as skeptics or atheists, having witnessed horrors that seemed incompatible with belief in a benevolent deity. Churches struggled to maintain their authority in societies where traditional sources of meaning had been called into question. The technological legacy of the war would reshape human life in ways that extended far beyond military applications. Aviation, which had evolved from a novelty to a vital military tool, would revolutionize transportation and communication. Radio technology, developed for battlefield coordination, would create new forms of mass media. Chemical processes designed to produce explosives and poison gas would find peaceful applications in agriculture and manufacturing. Medical advances forced by the urgent need to treat battle casualties would benefit civilian populations for decades. Plastic surgery, developed to repair facial wounds, would help accident victims and those born with deformities. Prosthetic devices, initially created for amputee veterans, would assist anyone who had lost limbs. Blood transfusion techniques, perfected in field hospitals, would save countless lives in peacetime emergencies. As 1918 drew to a close, the world faced the daunting task of constructing a lasting peace from the wreckage of the greatest war in human history. The leaders gathering in Paris for the peace conference would need to redraw the map of Europe, establish new international institutions, and somehow create conditions that would prevent such a catastrophe from recurring. Their decisions would affect not just the immediate post-war period, but would help shape the remainder of the 20th century. The challenge they faced was unprecedented in its complexity. Unlike previous European wars, which had typically resulted in marginal territorial adjustments and moderate indemnities, this conflict had destroyed entire empires and called into question the fundamental assumptions upon which European civilization had been based. The peace settlement would need to address not just competing territorial claims, but competing visions of how modern society should be organized. The armistice that had ended the fighting was only the beginning of a longer process of coming to terms with what the war had revealed about human nature and the fragility of civilization itself. The silence that had fallen over the battlefields of France would soon be filled with the voices of statesmen, diplomats, and ordinary citizens struggling to understand what they had lived through and how they might build a better world from its ruins. The Great War, as it was already being called, had ended. But its consequences were only beginning to unfold, creating ripples that would spread across decades and continents, affecting generations yet unborn. The soldiers sleeping peacefully in their trenches for the first time in 4 years could not know that the world they had fought to save was gone forever, replaced by something new and uncertain that would bear the permanent scars of their sacrifice. The Paris Peace Conference that opened in January 1919 brought together representatives from 32 nations in a setting that seemed designed to mock the devastation they had all endured. The opulent halls of Versailles, where European royalty had once danced while their subjects toiled in poverty, now hosted delegates who would reshape the continent according to principles that the old aristocracy would never have recognized. President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Europe as something approaching a messianic figure, greeted by crowds who saw in him the promise of a new international order based on justice rather than power. His 14 points had become a beacon of hope for peoples throughout Europe who dreamed of self-determination and democratic governance. Yet the academic idealist from Princeton was about to discover that translating noble principles into practical politics required compromises that would haunt the world for decades to come. Across the negotiating table sat leaders whose perspectives had been shaped by 4 years of unprecedented suffering. Georges Clemenceau, the Tiger of France, bore the scars of 2 German invasions in his lifetime and was determined that his country would never again face such devastation. David Lloyd George of Britain sought to balance French demands for security with his own nation's need for European stability and economic recovery. These pragmatic politicians had little patience for Wilson's idealistic vision when it conflicted with their nation's immediate security needs. The treaty that emerged from months of bitter negotiations reflected these competing pressures in ways that satisfied no one completely. Germany was stripped of territory, disarmed, and saddled with reparations payments that would cripple its economy for years to come. The famous War Guilt Clause, Article 231, forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the conflict and all its consequences. This legal fiction, designed to justify the harsh peace terms, would provide fertile ground for future demagogues who would exploit German resentment to build support for even more destructive wars. The map of Europe was redrawn with surgical precision that ignored the messy realities of ethnic distribution and economic interdependence. New nations emerged from the ruins of old empires, their borders drawn by diplomats who had never visited the territories they were dividing. Poland was reconstituted after more than a century of partition, but its frontiers encompassed millions of Germans who had no desire to live under Polish rule. Czechoslovakia combined Czechs, Slovaks, Germans, and Hungarians in an artificial state that existed more on paper than in the hearts of its diverse citizens. The creation of Yugoslavia satisfied the pan-Slavic dreams that had helped trigger the original conflict, but it also forced together Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and Bosnians whose mutual antagonisms would eventually tear the country apart. Austria was reduced to a German-speaking rump state forbidden from uniting with Germany, while Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory and much of its population to newly created neighbors. The Ottoman Empire's dissolution created even more complex problems in the Middle East, where British and French mandates replaced Turkish rule without consulting the Arab populations who had fought for independence. The Balfour Declaration's promise of a Jewish homeland in Palestine was now embedded in the peace settlement, creating competing claims to the same territory that would generate conflicts lasting well into the 21st century. Wilson's cherished League of Nations was incorporated into each of the peace treaties, but the international organization he envisioned as humanity's salvation was fatally weakened from birth. The United States Senate, suspicious of foreign entanglements and resentful of Wilson's failure to include Republicans in the peace negotiations, rejected American membership in the League. Without American participation, the organization lacked both the moral authority and practical power needed to maintain international order. The economic provisions of the peace settlement proved equally problematic. Germany's reparations burden, eventually set at the staggering sum of 132 billion gold marks, was based more on Allied financial needs than on any realistic assessment of German capacity to pay. The payments were designed to transfer wealth from Germany to the victorious powers, but they also created a cycle of economic instability that would contribute to the global depression of the 1930s. The human cost of implementing the new boundaries became apparent as millions of people found themselves minorities in states they had never chosen to join. Population transfers, forced migrations, and ethnic cleansing became common features of the post-war landscape as new governments sought to create ethnically homogeneous populations within their arbitrarily drawn borders. The principle of self-determination, which had sounded so noble in Wilson's speeches, proved impossible to implement in a continent where different ethnic groups had lived together for centuries. Russia, consumed by civil war and ideological revolution, was excluded from the peace negotiations entirely. The Bolshevik government that had taken the country out of the war was treated as a pariah regime, creating a power vacuum in Eastern Europe that would have profound consequences for future stability. The cordon sanitaire of new states created between Germany and Russia was intended to contain Bolshevik influence, but it also ensured that these two great powers would eventually seek to revise the settlement that had isolated them both. The peace treaties were signed amid great ceremony, but even as the ink dried on the documents, their shortcomings were becoming apparent. The settlement was too harsh to reconcile Germany to the new order, but too lenient to prevent eventual German recovery and revenge. It created new nations without giving them the military or economic strength needed to defend their independence. Most fatally, it established an international system based on the assumption that the victorious powers would remain united in enforcing the settlement, an assumption that proved tragically false as wartime solidarity gave way to peacetime competition. The demobilization of armies proceeded more smoothly than many had feared, but the transition from war to peace created its own set of challenges. Veterans returning to civilian life found themselves competing for jobs with women and immigrants who had filled their positions during the war. The promise of homes fit for heroes proved largely illusory, as governments struggled with the costs of reconstruction while simultaneously reducing military expenditures and war production. The influenza pandemic that continued to rage through 1919 claimed more lives than the war itself, creating a final cruel irony for families who had survived 4 years of combat, only to lose loved ones to disease in the moment of victory. Medical authorities, exhausted by years of treating battle casualties, found themselves overwhelmed by a biological enemy that respected no armistice agreements and recognized no national boundaries. Economic disruption accompanied the transition to peacetime production, as industries that had expanded dramatically during the war now faced the challenge of finding civilian markets for their products. The conversion of munitions factories to consumer goods production proved more difficult than anticipated, while the cancellation of military contracts created unemployment in regions that had prospered during the conflict. Social changes that had begun during the war accelerated in its aftermath. Women who had entered the workforce out of patriotic duty now demanded equal political rights as recognition of their contributions to victory. The right to vote, which had seemed like a radical demand before 1914, became reality in most Western nations as governments acknowledged that the old exclusions could no longer be justified. Class structures that had seemed permanent before the war were challenged by veterans who had shared the dangers of military service regardless of their social origins. Democratic ideals that Wilson had proclaimed as war aims became domestic realities, as returning soldiers demanded political reforms that would give substance to the principles they had fought to defend. The cultural impact of the war continued to reverberate through literature, art, and intellectual life, as creative minds struggled to find meaning in the devastation they had witnessed. The confident progressivism that had characterized pre-war thought gave way to profound skepticism about human nature and technological advancement. Writers and artists who had experienced the trenches created works that challenged comfortable assumptions about civilization and progress. Religious institutions faced a crisis of authority as traditional explanations of divine providence seemed inadequate to explain the scale of suffering the war had produced. Many veterans returned home as religious skeptics, having witnessed horrors that seemed incompatible with belief in a benevolent deity. Churches struggled to maintain their influence in societies where traditional sources of meaning had been called into question by the mechanized brutality of modern warfare. The technological legacy of the conflict began to transform civilian life in ways that extended far beyond military applications. Aviation, which had evolved rapidly under wartime pressure, now offered possibilities for commercial transportation and mail delivery that would shrink distances between nations and continents. Radio technology, developed for battlefield communications, created new forms of mass media that would reshape political discourse and popular culture. Medical advances forced by the urgent need to treat battle casualties began benefiting civilian populations. Surgical techniques, prosthetic devices, and pharmaceutical innovations developed in military hospitals found applications in peacetime medicine. Mental health treatment, though still primitive by later standards, began to recognize psychological trauma as a legitimate medical condition rather than simple cowardice. As the immediate crisis of war's end gave way to longer-term planning for reconstruction, the magnitude of the challenge became fully apparent. Entire regions of France and Belgium required complete rebuilding, their towns destroyed and their farmland contaminated with unexploded ordnance and chemical residues. The famous red zones, areas so thoroughly devastated that they were declared permanently uninhabitable, served as permanent monuments to the war's destructive power. The financial costs of reconstruction strained government budgets that had been depleted by 4 years of unprecedented military expenditure. War debts, both domestic and international, would burden the global economy for decades, while reparations payments created artificial flows of capital that distorted normal trade relationships and contributed to economic instability. By 1920, as the world attempted to return to some semblance of normalcy, it was clear that the Great War had ended one historical era and begun another. The confident, optimistic civilization that had existed before 1914 was gone forever, replaced by something more uncertain, more aware of human limitations, and more conscious of civilization's fragility. The silence that had fallen over the battlefields of France on November 11, 1918, marked not just the end of fighting, but the conclusion of an entire way of understanding the world. The generation that had marched off to war with flowers in their rifles had learned lessons about human nature and technological power that would shape the remainder of the 20th century. Their sacrifice had saved European civilization from German domination, but it had also revealed that civilization itself was far more fragile than anyone had previously imagined. The Great War was over, but its ghosts would haunt the world for decades to come, shaping the conflicts, revolutions, and social transformations that would define the modern age. The boys who had become men in the trenches of France would spend the rest of their lives trying to build a world worthy of their friends who had not returned, while their children would inherit both the trauma and the wisdom born from humanity's first encounter with the full destructive potential of industrialized warfare. The war to end all wars had ended, but the peace that followed would prove to be merely an armistice in a longer struggle to create a world where such devastation could never again be unleashed upon human civilization.